You don't mind us asking questions?
No, go on. No.
I've got a list at home of differences between the Manx Bible and the authorised English version.
Yes.
Some of them are quite big differences, aren't they? And
some of them are pretty free. Yes, the translators of the minor prophets, the prophets generally, and especially
like this business
the
of
Apocrypha, are very free.
Being fed by the ravens, which need
yes, that's right.
By the inhabitants of Ayrn.
Yes, that's right.
Well, there's quite a lot of things.
Well, I've never traced
Isn't there some mention in Hildesley's writings about the light of later knowledge or something?
I wouldn't be surprised.
Yes.
This is what they meant, you see, by consulting these authorities. And of course, although we tend to forget this now, there were various other Bible translations produced between 1611 and the revision of 1880. Yes, there were. Oh yes, quite a number. None of them was ever authorised, none was ever formally endorsed, but there was quite a lot of dissatisfaction for a long time throughout the 18th century with the authorised version on grounds of accuracy as scholarship improved and better manuscripts became available. So that it wouldn't be at all surprising that they would be different. Some of them, of course, are probably changes that are as I think Neen says, perhaps rationalising, because the 18th century was a very rational period. If it could see any way of getting out of a miracle by altering the text, it would.
What about the case of the Lord made the horse? The Lord made the horse and clothed his neck with thunder. Well, I can't remember can't remember what the Manx says about that.
There's a lot of things. Like
I mean, it doesn't. It seems there must be some mistake, surely. That have they mistranslated a word that similar words meaning one meaning a main and the other meaning thunder? Do you think, or what's happened?
Oh no, I think that sounds quite within the limits of Hebrew poetry, I think.
Yes?
Oh, I think so, yes, it's a poetical.
I see.
You see, the thunder, we talk about the thunder of the hooves.
Yes.
Don't we? Now, the mane, on the other hand, the streaming of the mane, you see, and the notion of the association of hair and strength, like the Samson story.
Yes.
You see, you can see by a poetical transition how the mane could become associated with thunder. I think that's quite possible.
Oh.
I've not looked that one up. Curiously enough, I noticed one which I came on quite by accident in the Song of Songs, where the English has terrible as an army with banners twice. The Manx version has, if I remember rightly, Sleden. Oh dear, Sleden Gailckagh and Ayrn, I think it is, the whole starry host of heaven. Seems absolutely, incapable of being fitted together. It must obviously repose on a conjecture about the corruption of the Hebrew text. This is what it is. The interesting thing is that the New English Bible has the Manx version too. In other words, this is a genuine old conjecture which modern translators, some modern translators, have thought fit to incorporate. I think many scholars think the Old Testament has been rather cavalierly handled by the translators of the New English Bible. They think they're rather too eager to amend and conjecture. But still, that's one, obviously, which is an old one, which has been picked up again by the New English Bible. Yeah, not exactly in the same words, but obviously the same reading, the same correction of something in the original. Describing one's life
I've never been able to understand.
Terrible as an army of banners is not very very formidable lady she must have been.
On page 9 here, Neen mentions this, of course, and this part about Samson's foxes with ribbons tied to their tails, I've never been able to understand that, what he means by this.
Well, I'm not quite sure without the text either.
No, I've tried to follow up the text and I still can't understand it. I don't know what it is. Well, he says that fox's tail is a bit of Hebrew slang, right?
Well, that again is one of these conjectures, I think, obviously.
Yeah. But anyway, to get back to the original point,
like
that wouldn't be something that these clergy then had looked up in the Greek translation.
Well, I think they would all certainly have Greek.
Yes, and Latin probably, would they?
Yes, they'd have, but their Latin's not particularly relevant from this point of view.
No.
They'd have Greek. I think it's very doubtful if any of them had any Hebrew, so that in fact they would be dependent on either the Greek version of the Old Testament, or I think there's very little doubt though that most of the time they translated the English. They may have occasionally introduced alterations where contemporary scholarship had second thoughts. But I don't believe for a moment that they solemnly worked their way through even the New Testament with the Greek Testament open in front of them and nothing else. I don't think there's any evidence for that. No, I think the former tongues is entirely from the type of page. They couldn't, of course, add the rest of it and with the former translations diligently compare, because there weren't any former translations to compare it with, as the English ones. If you've heard any of them, I think it on Sunday mornings. Somebody at the moment is reading selections from a book about English versions of the Bible, and they started off with one of Coverdale's. And of course it was almost word for word the authorised version, which I mean we tend to think of as a starting point, but really it's the end product. It was itself a revision of revisions of revisions of about a century of Bible translation into English at that time. And it pinched, if that's the word, I mean it accepted, shall we say, the suggestions of previous translators, especially Coverdale, very generously indeed. Many of the phrases we think of as the authorised version are really much older than that, or quite a bit older than that. Yes, we've still got the old type there. Before you get to Cronk, that's to say before the KN becomes KR, and before the nasalisation, which was presumably there in the vowel, has become strong enough to produce a consonant, which is fairly common in the
Because the Scottish Gaelic clock, don't you?
That's right, yes.
And Donegal.
Oh
yes, it's quite the right form. And of course the knock, of course, survives in place names where it got fossilised and passed into English, and the K then disappeared as it does in English words. And this is the usual situation, of course, in Scotland, where the names have carried on in English but have lost the language in which they were originally given.
So really, that change from knock to cronk, it's just a matter of spelling. It's nothing to do with any change of pronunciation.
No. It is a change of pronunciation in two respects. One, that knock becomes kn becomes kr, and similarly gn becomes gr, and tn becomes tr, as in through, envy. You see, was originally thnu, tnu.
I see. So it was actually pronounced.
There's a genuine, there's a genuine change there. And the second one is perhaps not. It's a matter of emphasis, as you might say. The vowel is nasalised. We're used to the idea from French that you get nasalisation from a following consonant, but in fact in Gaelic generally you get nasalisation from a consonant on either side. So M or N on either side of a vowel was liable to give some degree of nasalisation, and in Manx in some cases this has actually caused the intrusion of a consonant, that N in cronk, which originally was simply cronk with a nasalised vowel. But there's some of them, many of them have become fixed as real consonants. One assumes. Anyway, knock, Olivet, Esh, Chorhi. So yes, that's one of the things that is not found very much after Phillips. That is the treating of cur as a regular verb in the past and giving it the preterite
cur. You find it a lot in the writings of Medibeg Homrai.
Yes. Now that might be a survival, or it might be a starting again, treating the thing as a regular verb. I don't really know which way around that is. One of the complications here is that, you see, there are actually two verbs which in Manx have fallen together here. The stem of cur and the stem of tort are really two separate verbs. and if you start from Manx, you always have I still always have difficulty in Scottish Gaelic or Irish remembering which one I ought to use. Because, of course, in Manx they've coalesced. Now, all the bits, all the irregular bits, like Ayrn and so on, and the preterite hug and so on, these all, in fact, belong to tort, or called tort originally, which is, and the basic sense of this was give. The other one, this one, cur, is the verb send, basically. Not give, but send, you see. Now, the two have coalesced in their inflected forms, largely, except for odd survivals like this in Phillips, and gradually the two verb nouns fall together. Instead of tort, we have court, and then court and cur become alternatives completely, as you can often see in parallel phrases. A writer will use a court in one clause and a cur in the next. You know, they class them entirely as equivalent.
You get survivals like tort mow and that sort of thing.
Yes, tortus casuaric was, and in fact the older translators of some of the Old Testament were much fonder of tortus for gift, sacrifice. Tortus casuaric was the term for sacrifice, rather than aural, actually, which is of course a borrowed word. Offer. Yes.
Adrian practically told me the other day you couldn't say chormi, you see, I gave.
Yes.
I know what I did. I said it wasn't.
Well, you shouldn't say. Well, you can't say it in the sense of gave, but you can say it in the sense of sent. You could say.
Chapter.
Yes. Well, now that is rather interesting, because in fact the form hug chachteret is really a unit, and it simply means sent. You find in the earlier translation they didn't seem to be satisfied with hug alone in the sense of send, and he regularly adds upon a mission, upon an embassy, on there isn't any simpler word really in English for this, upon a a message ship. Is what it is.
So that churmi, which is found in Neddy Begg's writing, you think that's an Neddy's?
I think it might. It might be a survival. It's always dangerous to say things haven't survived, but you don't in the literary language get chur at all, as far as I know, after Phillips. You may get a very odd one, but I don't think normally ever after Phillips. So either it survived underground, and it was one of these things that the written language didn't admit. Perhaps
or Neddy Begg thought it was the right way to...
Well, yes, there is always this problem, you see, that what we have represents a kind of standardized thing in the written form, which may well have picked up features from some dialects and automatically rejected features from others. How this could be done, it's something of a loss to know, but still, it may well have done. Of course, once things started being published, this tends to create a thing. Other people tend to imitate the style of language they see in what's available already.
Can I ask
yes.
how he used it then, Ned Maddrell?
In all these Aesop's fables, he's got it. Instead of saying hug me, he says chur me,
Yes. It is just possible that it's possible that he's just because the two verbs are separate, and kurum is a perfectly regular verb. You see, it's got all its bits.
In Irish,
like Turum in the Irish, like Corham, but in Irish you get the Turum Pága, for instance, didn't you? The boys used to say to the girl, Turum Pága, give to me.
Yes, that's one. That's right. As distinct from Kurim, I send, or possibly I put place to the other one.
Give me a kiss was Turum Pága,
that's right. Turum.
Amongst the boys in the kiss.
Yes, that's right. Yes. Well, Phillips's imperative, of course, is tor. Is sometimes tor. He could have said tor thou peg.
Yes.
Quite happily.
This
T-O-Y-R-T-O-E.
the spelling of Irish, the VH in the middle. Now, is the second apparent, well, the second sort of written syllable of that connected with bear and bearum, bear in English and bearum in Manx?
Yes.
Actually,
It's
the verb bear.
yes, it's carry anyway. Yes, do
Yes,
bear.
carry.
Yes.
Yeah, you've got the B-E-I-R.
It's bring to and so give is the basic
Is it
sense
so
of that.
Bearum, haven't
Tall
you?
bear or something, like
It is, yes. You'll find this in Irish, and it's the
prefix.
in the days. You see, what happened was that these prefixes were stressed in some forms and unstressed in others. They're always stressed in the imperative. So you get tather, give thou, and that's when you get tor. Did get tor in Phillips. It's always stressed initially in the verb noun, so you get tabbert, torch, the act of giving. Apart from that, it won't be stressed in the positive forms, so the first singular present indicative is doverim, I give, and the do is pre-stress, before the stress. It drops entirely in X, and the verb therefore begins apparently with V, which is verum. I have no idea where it comes from. On the other hand, in the dependent form, you get hardaver, and hence makes harderum. I do not, you see, where the verb, the base is not quite the same, because I'm not quite sure which one it's derived from. There's a variety of different things. It may be T-A-I-B-H-R, which would, I think, very likely come out as with initial D on the beginning, DT, would go, I think, der, and then that's probably where we have that type from. The other verb, of course, is asper, which is that in efero, put forth, and that means simply say, speak. And this is what you get in aber.
Yes.
Aber. It's the same base, actually, as we better not go on.
No, it's very interesting. Now we've got another problem coming up here now, haven't we?
Yes.
After GC.
Yes, that's right. Oh yes, if you like that one. Gis da Ostelen, yes, Gis a pair, of course.
Yes.
Yes, no,
That's of his. Either of his or to his. It has both values. It would normally just be a single A, the double A is just the length. It usually spells it with a single A circumflexed very often.
It's not the same as this Gis.
Oh no, these are two quite different words. Gis da Ostelen and two of his. Ausstullen, I suspect, actually, was the pronunciation in the old one. Ostel and Austel are presumably, as usual, the two different developments. We were talking the other day, weren't we, about Jaramud and Jarud, with the lenited and unlenited M. It looks in Manx as if Abstol had the B lenited, Avstol, and so Austel, or there are always two possibilities where you get medial BH or MH disappearing after, especially A. Either you get a real diphthong, which is what you get, for example, in the adjective yawer, long, or from exactly the same shape, you may get simply a rounded vowel, which is what you get in the noun your book. Now, not etymologically, I suppose they must have different etymologies, but they have identical shapes. Both of them in conventional Gaelic spelling are L-E-A-B-H, so on. You see, and yet one comes out as Yawer and the other as Lior. Scottish Gaelic has the same distinction. I think, in fact, the two alternatives have been preserved, as it were, in this case, because the two senses are both useful, as it were. But you never quite know which, and obviously I think Phillips has the Austel, has the ow type, whereas the usual type has probably the rounded vowel Ostel. I think this is the other type. And it isn't a sound change. These are two different developments from the same starting point, which compete with one another, possibly in different areas. I think this is very likely one difference, like the Gailckagh business. There are some places where you get unrounding of the original O, and some places where it survives. Possibly other places where you get it rounded again before the ch, or something like that.
And the nasal Clongach, You even get Clongach in Clochach,
yes.
The name of
yes.
the round tower in Peel Castle.
The title, the justice, you get an Giusdis, Giuisdis. Now, why you? Of course, you see, they never assimilated D as strongly as Manx did. Manx, of course, would substitute D in a case like that. J, therefore, of course, but it would treat it as a palatal D. But their palatal D was never J, so that when they got English J, they either rendered it by sh, or here, perhaps, as a sort of spelling pronunciation, with the GI. Scottish Gaelic, of course, has forms like Duke, D-I-U-K, D-I-U-C, sorry. You know, and modern terms like that. And in addition to, for George, they had not only Shorsa, which is the older type with sh substituted for j, but also Diorsa, D-E-O-R-S-A. They wouldn't stand two j's in one word, but Diorsa is a possibility. But there's nothing corresponding otherwise, I think, for example, to Manx Juan. I mean, we don't actually have the j pronunciation really accepted, as far as I know.
Although actually it could be mentioned it's not really acceptable locally.
Well, I think that's wrong. It may be, well, Leslie will tell us about this. I remember a story of his about being prohibited from using ch at the end of past participles. But the interesting thing is that you find...
to get the lisp.
That's right, but you find Phillips actually spelling them. There's one, for example, from Yena. He has Yenich, and it does end in I-T-C-H. There's not the slightest doubt that he intended the final consonant to be quite strongly assimilated. And he has nouns like Egij, I-D-G, my youth. So there's no doubt that the assimilation in the beginning of the 17th century was quite noticeable.
Is it certain?
Quite, and this is quite different from the position, for example, in Ireland at the same time, when place names and personal names are being written with T's and D's by English speakers, that they clearly, that the degree of assimilation was nothing like as strong in Irish as it was in Manx at that period.
Final T and D, you mean?
Well, anywhere, you see.
I wonder if Phillips could have represented them any other way, though. How would he have written "tif" at the end of the word?
Well, he can do it. Well, you can do it because it's interesting how they all do tend to come round to the ordinary convention that if you can't indicate it by putting the vowel afterwards, you put it in front. And so I think there's no doubt that when he writes Trinaid, he probably does mean Trined.
Yes.
But he, as far as I remember, he never actually spells it with DG or DJ. Exactly why some words are shown with this heavy assimilation and some are not, I don't quite know.
Is there any evidence of Phillips having known Irish or Scottish Gaelic?
No, I don't think so.
No.
I don't think there would be.
But the possibility that he might have been in touch with Bedell, do you think, Bishop Bedell?
It would have been interesting, actually, yes, because the Irish Prayer Book and the Irish New Testament were coming out about the time he was doing this, and I suggested before that he was probably spurred on. Of course, the Welsh one was earlier. Both the Welsh Bible and the Welsh Prayer Book were earlier than his time. But he must. I think he would certainly be aware that an Irish one was in preparation.
Yes.
Yes, I think so.
I would have thought if he was working on material like this, he would at least be conversant with other people engaged in the same operation.
Yes, but I don't think it would be. He could really get much practical assistance.
No, but I mean he would probably be aware of it and might have some slight influence on him, possibly.
Yes, I don't think they would actually be out in time. No. And then, of course, with the difference of orthography, and if he didn't actually read the language, nobody in Man presumably read Irish in the ordinary in the Irish script. And the Irish printing, in fact, of course, too, because they were using Queen Elizabeth's Irish fount, you see. They didn't print in Roman letters either, so that there was a sort of double difficulty. They weren't used to the letters, they weren't used to the orthography.
Queen Elizabeth.
I think hardly anybody would have would have thought of using the Irish prayer book in the Irish say in the 17th century. They would have had big difficulties, of course, with vocabularies.
But probably the sound, the spoken word to them.
Had they been able to hear an Irish speaker read it to them, I think that would have been quite different. Yes.
Remember, do you know the modern movement to change Irish from the Queen Elizabeth's?
Oh yes, well of course it's the traditional traditional manuscript.
But it was an English script, wasn't it? Not Irish.
Ultimately, yes, it was the so-called insular, which was used both in it was used for writing Anglo-Saxon. They called it bookhand.
But it wasn't Irish, really, was it? There's a big
well, it's hard to say. It's common to. No, it's rather before the European influence gets going. It's a peculiar. It's usually called insular. It's a peculiar modification of West European. The West European bookhands were mostly then uncial. That's big sort of capital letter types. They were giving the Hiberno-Saxons is the other term for it, the Irish Saxon type, was not, of course, a cursive script. I mean, the letters were written separately, but they did have essentially write small letters and capitals, and it was really common to both areas. It's hard to say sort of where it came from. There's, if you like, you could make out a sort of case for it coming from Ireland to England, because the first, well, some of the earliest places, of course, that were evangelised in the north of England were all done from Scottish and Irish bases, and insofar as they taught, well, they did teach, in fact, yes, they came to a very considerable extent and taught, Bede says, the young Northumbrians to read and write in Latin, and they would obviously teach them to write that script. It's the informal script as opposed to the great big illuminated book scripts.
You know, talking about these endings again.
Whereas, from Augustine at Canterbury, you would presumably have had some contemporary Italian hand being diffused if you had anything. And then, of course, it's eventually overrun after the conquest by the Carolingian type, which, of course, was formed under Charles the Great, but that again, of course, is at his palace school, which was under the domination of Alcuin from York, who had been brought up on the Hiberno-Saxon. So we come back to it again, really. Yes, but it had been domesticated on the continent for quite a long time before it came back again and displaced the Anglo-Saxon bookhand, which then vanishes, and then of course after that people think of it as the Irish script. But it had been really the British script, as you might say, and of course the Welsh wrote in it. All the old Welsh fragments are in it too. It was common to all three, and probably Scotland too. I don't know that anything survives from as early as that.
I hope we're not asking you.
Not at all, no. It's a great way of not getting through the text.
There's something else I was trying to explain to Adrian the other day. Now, English is my Chenian Mera, as everyone else's, Ned, in his heydays, when I first started learning Manx, and he was a sprightly young man of about 70, and he spoke Manx very quickly, didn't he, and fluently. He had an awful lot of what I, in my ignorance, would call funny endings to words, which I couldn't possibly imitate as an English, not being a native speaker. Did you find that, Leslie, with the native speakers?
All these nyagan, Thai nyagan,
Did you find the native speakers in Peel pronounced funny little trills and things on the end of words?
And particularly nasalizations stuck in the middle, is it, that we'd know. This camel business was only a mild one compared with some of them.
Ned says, Ned used to pronounce words as if there was another part of them missing. I can't really put it in grammatical terms, but I couldn't attempt to imitate them.
Well, so instead of saying could for share, he'd probably say could, would he?
Oh yes, but it was even
like
more
that.
pronounced than this, though.
Yes, but the palatal final with there, yes, which is what the I is there for.
Yes.
Really.
Now those have gone from Manx. We cannot ever imitate them.
What was the one you said? Gedden.
Yes, this Gedden. Yes.
Well, it would be a palatal, yes, it's food.
Yes, but there were others even more complicated. There's so many of them. I couldn't possibly imitate them now.
Yeah.
I do have that same experience with them, Leslie.
Oh yes, indeed, yes.
Have you got tapes of this?
Huh?
Have you got tapes of Ned in his heyday?
Yes,
More or less, because they wouldn't, not really in his heyday, and I have, see, when you go back to 1928, 29, you see, that's what I mean, and
yes.
that's when these, I was getting from that, because with no recording, it just had to be written down. That's why I can't spell in Manx, because it was so, I can't spell anything, but they were so absolutely determined to make our own phonetics as near as we could to things and so on.
Well, that's what Manx spelling does
But he
anyway.
made us write 3 hours and so on for every single hour.
We can never get them
I
back
don't
then.
think you can. No,
they've gone, and
it's possible to conjecture final palatal consonants partly on the basis of spelling and partly on the basis of etymology, but it's.
Ned probably couldn't imitate his grandfather either.
Yes.
Ned probably would find difficulty in imitating his
Doesn't
grandparents.
he say somewhere that he read this to a fisherman on the quay in Douglas, and he said, "That's the Manx my grandfather spoke." Somewhere in Reese's.
I think it's Moore who's.
Oh, Moore was it?
I think it was Moore who tried it. Yes, who tried it on people. Yes.
Try reading Bishop Phillips.
Yes. Mind you, exactly what that means, one doesn't know. You see.
No.
I mean, he presumably read it with the contemporary pronunciation.
Yes.
So that would mean that what they recognised was the vocabulary and the syntax as being familiar.
Yeah.
But it's hard to say what that meant, I'm afraid.
Yes.
I've often wondered about that, what that
Yes, I don't quite know what it meant.
No.
Unless he did in fact try to draw something for pronunciation out of the spelling.
Yes.
But just what he would have got out would be hard to say, I think.